Imagine, just for a second, if a modern tech startup or a massive retail giant suddenly decided to raise a private army and just conquer an entire continent. I mean, it sounds like absolute science fiction, right? Well, the crazy thing is, it actually happened. Throughout history, the immense legendary wealth of the Indian subcontinent acted like this massive magnet for conquerors. We're talking about a region so vast, so incredibly rich, and so formidable that it famously turned back Alexander the Great. Even mighty emperors like Muhammad Ghori faced crushing, humiliating defeats before anyone could even establish a foothold. It literally took the Mughal Empire generations to consolidate its power there. Yet the entity that ultimately conquered this massive, wealthy subcontinent wasn't a rival empire. It wasn't some legendary military conqueror. It was a startup, a small, scrappy, and honestly desperate trading company from Britain that somehow managed to execute the most massive hostile takeover in human history. So how exactly does a corporation conquer a subcontinent? Well, welcome to this explainer, because we are going to find out.
But before we get into the how, to really understand the sheer scale of this, we have to wrap our heads around a truly staggering number: $45 trillion. That is the estimated wealth extracted from India over roughly 200 years of British rule. Think about that for a second. This wasn't just a political conquest. This was a corporate heist of unprecedented, world-altering proportions. The fabled golden bird, as India was known, was just systematically drained of its wealth.
Okay, let's dive right into the chronological roadmap of how this multi-trillion-dollar extraction actually happened. We'll be walking through the startup, gaining a foothold, the power shift, eliminating competition, the breaking point, and finally, the final takeover.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, the startup. And let me tell you, it was a pretty desperate beginning.
To make sense of this, we actually have to go back to the end of the 16th century. This is long before the British Empire was anywhere near being a global superpower. In fact, the British were incredibly late to the game here. By the 1400s, European explorers were scrambling, just desperately searching for sea routes to bypass the land-based spice monopolies. The Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama reached India way back in 1498. By 1602, the Dutch had entered the scene, and they were raking in massive profits. The British? Well, they didn't even arrive in India until 1608. The East India Company was formed on December 31st, 1600 by just 25 traders in London with a royal charter. And they were essentially just frantically chasing the massive spice profits that the Portuguese and the Dutch were already enjoying.
And here's a wild fact. India wasn't even their first choice. They originally tried to set up shop in Indonesia in 1601, but the Dutch and Portuguese essentially bullied this scrappy little British startup right out of the region. Facing total ruin and almost certain bankruptcy, they had to make a really desperate pivot to India. On August 24, 1608, their ship, the Hector, landed at Surat in Gujarat. But when their captain, William Hawkins, traveled to Agra to ask the Mughal Emperor Jahangir for trading permission, he was flat out rejected. Why? Because the Portuguese were already there, paying the emperor heavy taxes specifically to keep the British out.
Which brings us to Section 2, gaining a foothold, breaking into the market.
So you're a desperate startup. How do you break into a market when the reigning superpower literally won't let you in? Well, you force your way in. Step 1 went down in 1612. British traders clashed with the Portuguese at a village called Swally, near Surat, and despite being the clear underdogs, the British won. This completely shattered the illusion of Portuguese invincibility. Which leads to Step 2. This underdog victory highly impressed the local Mughal governor, Sardar Khan. He finally granted them local trading rights. But Step 3 was the absolute masterstroke. Think about this for a second. A diplomat named Sir Thomas Roe managed to manipulate the great Emperor Jahangir simply by speaking fluent Persian and offering him shiny European novelties, like mechanical watches. It was a brilliant psychological play, and it worked perfectly. The company finally secured the right to set up trading posts across Mughal territories.
All right, moving to Section 3, the power shift, how they went from trade to outright conquest.
Over the next few decades, the company made an absolute fortune exporting Indian silk, cotton, tea, and spices back to Europe. But, as is often the case, mere trading just wasn't enough. In 1670, King Charles II issued a charter that quite literally changed world history. Just imagine a modern CEO today being given the legal right to mint their own money, command a private army, make political alliances, declare war, and exercise civil law over any territory they captured. No way, right? But that's exactly what happened here. With the stroke of a pen, they went from being simple spice merchants to an unchecked, sovereign military force.
And as you might expect, armed with this massive new military power, the company got arrogant. In 1686, they actually tried to fight the mighty Mughal Empire, and they were crushed. They were forced to pay a humiliating fine of 50 lakh rupees, or 5 million rupees. But let's fast forward a bit to 1757. Aurangzeb has died, the Mughal Empire is weakening, and the company is now led by Robert Clive. Using a very calculated mix of bribery and betrayal, Clive won the Battle of Plassey against the Nawab of Bengal. And as the victors, they didn't just take power. They imposed a penalty of 3 crore rupees. That is a staggering 30 million rupees. This exponential, crushing fine instantly plunged one of India's richest, most vibrant regions into desperate poverty.
At this point, the local rulers realized the terrifying threat the British now posed. So in 1764, an alliance was formed. You had the Nawab of Bengal, the Nawab of Awadh, and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II himself, all teaming up to crush the East India Company at the Battle of Buxar. But the alliance failed. The company's superior tactics won the day. Following this victory, the 1765 Treaty of Allahabad granted the East India Company the total right to collect taxes across Bengal. So let that sink in. A private corporation was now officially the primary tax collector for millions of everyday citizens.
That brings us to Section 4, eliminating competition, dismantling the Marathas.
With the Mughals effectively weakened, the British had one sprawling obstacle left on the board, the Maratha Empire. Now, the crucial thing to understand here is that the British didn't conquer them purely through brute military might. They systematically dismantled them from the inside out, through division. After the death of a key Maratha leader in 1772, the empire fractured. We start seeing internal power struggles, even an assassination. And then, a controversial figure named Raghunath Rao actually went to the British begging for military aid to secure his own power. Naturally, the British happily obliged. This dragged the Marathas into 3 devastating Anglo-Maratha wars over the next few decades. Through calculated strategic treaties like Salbai and Basan, the British just continuously picked off weakened factions one by one. Ultimately, they completely abolished the title of the Maratha leader, the Peshwa, leaving the East India Company as the absolute supreme power in India.
Now we arrive at Section 5, the breaking point, oppression and rebellion.
By the 1800s, the company was the undisputed ruler, but their policies had become deeply, deeply oppressive. And honestly, nothing highlights this better than the doctrine of lapse, which was introduced in 1848. This was essentially a cruel administrative loophole. The rule was, if an Indian ruler died without a biological male heir, their kingdom wouldn't just pass to an adopted son or a relative like it traditionally would. Nope, it would automatically be swallowed up by the East India Company. The British used this sneaky paperwork trick to legally annex massive historic states like Satara, Nagpur, and Jhansi. As you can imagine, it completely infuriated local royalty and regular citizens alike. Add to that the crushing tax burdens on common people, and the entire country was rapidly becoming a powder keg.
And then, something incredibly eerie and mysterious happened. All across the country, ordinary flatbreads, chapatis, and blankets began circulating from village to village, home to home. There were no symbols on them, no written messages, no slogans, nothing. Yet wherever they appeared, the local populations became visibly energized and agitated. It was this silent grassroots call to arms, and it completely baffled the British. They had absolutely no idea who was making them, how they were being transported, or what the ultimate signal even was.
I mean, it was brilliant psychological warfare. Think about it. The mightiest military force on the subcontinent was completely stressed out and paralyzed by an underground network of bread delivery that they couldn't see, understand, or stop. As British official J.W. Shearsher noted at the time, this unexplainable distribution caused considerable alarm among colonial officials. They were terrified because they knew something huge was coming.
And then, the spark finally caught. A rumor spread through the military barracks that the new rifle cartridges, which the soldiers physically had to bite to open, were greased with cow and pig fat. This was deeply, fundamentally offending to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. This was the flashpoint. It led to a massive, highly coordinated uprising. Legendary figures like the soldier Mongol Pandi, the Queen of Jhansi Rani Lakshmi Bai, and the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar led a furious, bloody revolution against the British. For a brief, shining moment, it actually looked like the company's rule was over. But ultimately, by leveraging their superior resources and brutally extending the conflict, the British managed to suppress the uprising. Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 6, the final takeover, the end of the company. The 1857 revolution was ultimately crushed, yes, but the sheer scale of the uprising completely horrified London. The British government finally realized that a private, profit-driven corporation could no longer be trusted to manage an entire subcontinent. And this brings us to the ultimate ironic fate of the East India Company itself. In 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. Essentially, they fired the company. All of the East India Company's stolen territories, their massive assets, their private armies, and their unimaginable wealth were instantly transferred to the direct control of the British Crown under Queen Victoria. So the corporate monopoly was dead, for sure, but formal state-sponsored British imperial rule had just begun.
The tragic reality here is that for the local population, life didn't improve. In many ways, the new system just further systematized their subjugation. As the historical sources point out, everyday Indian farmers became mere tenants on their own ancestral land. They were forced to pay crushing agricultural taxes to newly appointed landlords known as zimindars, who were fiercely loyal to the British Crown. A vast, wealthy, and ancient nation had been entirely stripped of its sovereignty. Which leaves us with this final, really profound question to consider. How did a small, desperate group of 25 traders, simply looking for spice profits, manage to write the permanent blueprint for 2 centuries of total imperial subjugation? It really challenges us to deeply consider the mechanics of corporate power, the absolute danger of unchecked monopolies, and just how quickly a relentless pursuit of profit can transform into the brutal conquest of a nation. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the history you think you know.